So welcome this afternoon. We were supposed to have 100 and some people today, so glad to see it's filled out. Today we're discussing the exam 70-473. My name is James Herring. I'm part of the Global Black Belt team at Microsoft, where I help implement cloud-based solutions, usually around data and AI. So been doing SQL Data Warehouse and APS and a lot of the other stack for almost 25 years, so lots of fun. This is designed to be interactive. If you guys have a question, please raise your hand. I want you guys to take the exams and study. So the exam, I'm going to go over basically the concepts and the ideas of the exam, things that you need to look at, things that you need to study. These slides will be ready, and I actually have a study guide with this small group. If you guys want a study guide to help out, I can share it afterwards. I keep it on a thumb drive with me. But this exam has been available since 2015. It's one of the older exams that are out there. It was last updated in June, and I've got some of the changes that are in there with the June. And it's really designed for the professionals that want to understand and identify the trade-offs between design a public and a hybrid cloud solution. Basically, more around the SQL Server type of products. One change that you'll see in a minute is the tools around SQL Data Warehouse are no longer on this exam. Those are more on 475 and 776. But with that said, if you do the measure up exams, I took one again yesterday, they still actually have how do you best get data from SQL Server on-premise to SQL Data Warehouse. The answer is BCP, right? So just make sure you understand that. I just flipped through it, yeah. So the MCSA, this is one of the exams that's around the MCSA exam, so you can take this and two others. And if you look outside this room, there's a board that actually shows each MCSA track. But they really are specialists that know how to work on the products, on the product stack, with an advanced knowledge, and people that have hands-on and practical experience. How many of you guys have Azure accounts now? Okay, how many have touched? Y'all haven't touched Azure? These exams are a little bit tougher if you don't have Azure access. So if you need to get a 30-day trial, and I think there's a couple places here that you can get trial editions as well. One of the best recommendations I have is if you have a local DreamSpark account, community college or something that does that, sign up for the $75 class in economics, get you a DreamSpark account and get you an Azure subscription. But it's actually really easy to get on that. I still maintain mine through my colleges as well, just to see what's out there and what's not. It does require passing two exams, and after taking this, you only need one more for an MCSE. MCSA is required for an MCSE certification as well. So this is all about cloud focus, right? It's a hybrid type solution, but it's really focused on getting people into the cloud, folks into the cloud. These are updated, like I said. This link, and like I said, these slides will be shared, I think later today or tomorrow. But check this link because there's a late breaking updates on this. It's a little PDF document. And what I would recommend is you pull that document out if you want to build your own study guide, because this is all about prepping and getting ready for this exam. Download that, print it out, and then go to Azure and the documentation in Azure, do a search on each one of those sections, and it'll give you a walkthrough for almost every single piece of this exam. And if you want to learn how to do this and pass this exam, do the walkthroughs, learn them, and then go get a measure up if you really want that extra step to get into it. But it's really just about doing it once or twice and understanding the concepts behind it. The basics of the exam, it's going to take you 1 to 3 hours to take, 40 to 60 questions. You can review the questions unless it's a type of question where it's a scenario. The scenario is going to give you basically a 1 or 2 pager. And after you answer the questions in that and go next, you cannot go back and change those questions. So be aware of that during the taking of the exam. You'll get a piece of note paper. Here, I think it's 8.5 by 14, flip front and back. Make sure you write small. It's a big Sharpie sometimes. But they will not give you another piece of paper during the exam. And when you're doing architectural type of exams, that can be very frustrating, I assure you. It can include up to 20 different types of questions on that. As you guys are probably aware, these Microsoft exams are adaptive. So if you struggle with one area, it may focus a little bit more on that area just to ensure that you understand it, or it may come at you from a different angle. They don't take off points for a wrong answer. You get points added for correct answers. It's 700s a passing score in this. And it's honestly, internally at Microsoft, how many Microsoft folks are here? Anybody? No? So internally at Microsoft, we tell the guys to go in, take an exam, fail it, learn the environmentals of it. I know that that's an expensive path for some customers to take, but quite honestly, if you do it at the right time of year, you'll get a retry within 30 days, usually for free. Check with the people that do the testing centers because they do have it at a couple times a year. If it's a beta exam, they're not going to give you that. But with these exams, typically, one of the most frustrating aspects to it is that you go in, and I study on 327-inch monitors, and I can see everything on my screen with my measure up. I go to the exam testing center, it's like I walked into 1989, right? I've got these little CRTs that are 14, 11 inches if I'm lucky, and I have to pan left and right to even see the complete question or answer. And the environmentals are very important when you're trying to take an exam, right? So make sure that you go to the testing center, and this is why I tell Microsoft employees, go where you're going to take the exam, take it. If you fail it, you know, no big deal. Learn what the environmentals are. If you're wearing watches, jewelry, hats, all that stuff, they're going to take it, they're going to lock it in the safe. And if you go to where I live in Boondocks in North Carolina, so if you go where I take an exam at, they may be drawing blood right beside you, right? It's not exactly a very...
That's where we take it.
Okay. Well, good. So some of these, this is from all these presentations that you'll see, we actually do internally at Microsoft too. So you'll see some of the takeaways that we have for these. You guys are getting the same content material that we give internal Microsoft folks. If you do see a confidential underneath, none of this stuff is confidential. This is all public and available on Microsoft. I'm not even going to go over that. So the first section here, and this is really important. When you look at the sections, it's usually going to give you 3 to 5 main topic areas of discussion that it's going to cover for. If you stay for the next exam, prep session 475, it's went from 4 to 3 in about a quarter. We update these exams every quarter now, and with Azure, if you're familiar with Azure, there's a lot of change, a lot of constant change, which is a good thing, right? Except for us database guys, we like slower change. Consistency is good. So the biggest piece here is design, implement database solutions. You'll also see where it says design, implement. It may actually change that to implement versus design and implement. So the first section is going to cover designing a hybrid SQL Server solution. It's going to go deep into design geo, redundancy, disaster recovery, some of the HA capabilities, depending on how you set it up, the data storage architecture. With Polybase, you're not going to see this with Azure SQL. With SQL Data Warehouse, you may. With an on-premise SQL Server, you may have Polybase connectivity to a data lake or to a blob store, that kind of thing. I wouldn't worry too much about that on this exam. The next ones, they're going to start adding to it. As it becomes more mainstream with ADF, Azure Data Factory, Azure Data Lake, you're going to see it a little bit more where you're going to have to get into the details of configuring role-based security, setting that up, getting keys, and a little bit more. But again, going through the walkthroughs once or twice and taking good notes, Notepad++, thank you, is very good to use for documenting that process and going through it and repeating it. Most of the database folks don't worry about ARM templates too much. That's probably going to change. They're very useful for configuring, setting these up so you can have a practice area. And always check out Microsoft Virtual Academy if you're not familiar with that, because there's walkthroughs there that can be very useful to this as well. Next, it's about talking about the VMs. Understanding IaaS is important with this exam. understand the security architecture, the configuring of the firewall rules, just like if you're configuring SQL Server on-premise, exposing it through the IPs and the firewall. It's important here as well, especially when you're talking about well, SQL Data Warehouse. You may still see it on some pieces where you have to configure the firewall rules for it, so understand that. And then migrate an on-premise database. We're going to go back through this list a little bit more detail here in a second. And then configure and optimize VM sizes by workload. And you'll see here, this is one of the updates. This whole section is completely gone off the exam now. So all this is moved into 776 and 475 a little bit more. So you don't have to worry about that. So when we're first talking about some of the hybrid HA capabilities, we're talking about always-on availability groups, database mirroring, some of the same things that we still have in SQL Server, but we're exposing it to the cloud and moving it out. Understand that you can use the certificates and that partners don't need to be in the same Active Directory domain, and no VPN is required. When you see the decks on this particular slide deck, I inherited it, so I keep it updated as much as I can. There's links on most of these slides, and if you look in the notes, if they share those as well, I've got notes with links on those as well. Must be right outside. Understand the hybrid HA with log shipping, back and restore, again, very similar to SQL Server, but there are some caveats with how it's configured and set up, especially when we're talking about blob storage for backup and DR and HA. When we're talking about server VM with high availability, understand the difference between database mirror availability groups. Yes? Yes? Oh, how would I describe blob storage? So blob storage is really web HDFS, but if you look at it, it's a container type of topology, how it's exposed to the web. The easiest way to think about it is that it's a file path that grows, but when you're looking at it from like a user perspective, it's almost like a file-based control that has a top-level container that's going to have a key to access it. So you have to be a little bit careful, because if you're using like Polybase and I store, say, text files in it that are the same format and stuff, I can actually write a select statement against that blob storage, and it'll loop through it with a single select statement and consume all that and read it into a view or a store procedure and that kind of stuff. But from a physical, actual nature, it's just an extension of a file path in a web HDFS. So it's a HDFS being Hadoop data file system. It's a distributed file system underneath. It's very similar in nature physically to data lake store. It's just a little bit older, and how you set it up is important, because when we talk about blob storage, the rates on the throughput can be slower if you select certain types versus, say, a table type of blob. So what we typically do is the blob, the data size increases regularly on that, and the throughput, the I/O, increases regularly too. But from strictly this, it's almost like a file share. There's really not elasticity in a blob storage. There's a file size restriction, and it used to be around 300 gigabytes per single file. That's increased. And then there's a blob itself. The entire container can be about 500 terabytes, I think. So there are some pretty broad restrictions on it, but it's important to know that if you're storing a database that's 30, a terabyte even, that you may actually run out of space, and in that case you may want to get an open source or some type of stitching tool that breaks it apart, and they'll re-stitch it if you copy it back and forth. There are some IOP restrictions, and some of that can be alleviated if you actually take express route type of stuff, because once you do express route, then you're on our internal domain, which is a 10 gig connection between data centers. So the idea is to get it up there quickly. But if you're using AZ copy, and say I take a terabyte backup and I stitch it into 10 different files, or break it apart into 10 different files, then I can use AZ copy, and it'll parallel load all those files up in the blob kind of sequential or horizontally, like a distributed structure. So a little bit off topic, but it's a great question. Where I typically like to use block blob is if I'm using a cold store, a cheap cold store. It's a little bit better than Data Lake on the cost, but it's a little bit slower on the performance because Data Lake truly is an HDFS that's exposed, and that's where we've got it. That will scale out to infinity, theoretically. Block blob does not. So, answer your question? Yep. So when we're talking about the virtual machine HA and the SQL Server based HA, this really gets to where you're talking about the need for zero data loss, being able to recover point-in-time recovery, and the number of replicas that you can have. So, and the readable secondaries. That's typically the more important piece because you may have a snapshot that you have limited ability from the last snapshot versus if you have a readable secondary where you can mount it and someone can actually write reports against that. So I typically I haven't touched VMs regularly in years. Honestly, I'm a big PAS guy now. I like PAS. I like having the low management overhead of that and being able to just monitor the performance and the queries and everything else. So understand that the VMs, the requirements for the VMs, the class of machines, and that kind of stuff, you'll see certain ones that are more expensive. And if you get something with a GPU for a database, check yourself. It's not necessary. Not unless you're doing 2017 and you actually want to do some Python type stuff, right? So with some of the, this is just an example, and the way you deploy it, I like to put the links in it for a classic PowerShell, classic piece, and then the ARM template, resource manager, it should say ARM in there. So these are different ways to deploy it. ARM is probably the way that's going to go forward. It's a little bit more powerful, I think, than PowerShell. It's easier to deploy because you can use Visual Studio to deploy, check in, check out, make updates, and share it. PowerShell is still one of those code languages, script languages that you either do or you don't. So, disaster recovery considerations. When we're talking about blobs, again, this is important when you're setting it up, how you want to have either zone redundant storage, locally redundant storage, or geo redundant storage, right? The number of replicas that are stored either locally in a certain area, regionally, or geographically where you can actually separate countries so you can store it in Canada or the US. This is more important. I know it's not on the exam anymore, but it's more important when you're talking about the PAS offerings, say like SQL Data Warehouse, because those backups are not something you control. They're done every 3 hours, and when you have a geo-redundant backup with that, you can designate where it's going to be stored and when, but you don't really have a lot of control over, say, take a backup now, right? So if you're going to load a data warehouse, it's not the same process. So the biggest thing here, again, is just understanding how many replicas there are. There's typically 3, and how many replicas are going to be local versus where they're stored at. Yes? Yeah, Windows Server, yeah. I got to get out of the acronyms here. So yeah, Windows Server failover cluster. This is important. I mean, when you're talking about failover clustering, setting it up in there, don't try to, if you're familiar with APS, don't try to set up a really complex structure in there. That's because you're going to have separate servers that are going to be failover clusters that may be just stationary, kind of like a witness server that you're going to be paying for. And that's really, I think, some of the trade-offs to understand on a PAS versus IaaS, and even a SaaS and some of the stuff that's coming with like Cosmos DB as well. So yeah, it's important to understand that really from a cost perspective. Have you guys played with the calculator in Azure? It changes regularly too. It's actually a very good tool if you want to estimate your costs and this is where it gets into ExpressRoute, Blob Store. And if you want to get into like a hot and cold type storage and you say that you want to be able to dismount 30% of your data and store it in a cheaper storage versus SQL Data Warehouse, which is going to be solid state blob store, but it's also local. So it's going to perform better. It's got about a lot more IOs versus blob store. But with Polybase, you can bring that data locally at basically any time you need to. So if you have quarterly, semi-annual reports, that type of stuff, you can still store them cold. You have views on top of it, merge the two data if your user's query span across that time period. And if you need to bring it back locally, it's just a CTAS, which is a create table to select, or in SQL World a select into type operation. So, but it's really important with the calculator because you can save a lot of money by using that. And I like to push SQL Data Warehouse too because we're able to pause that service, right? And we can pause that with T-SQL, or we can pause it with PowerShell, or we can set up a job that just pauses it before we do our loads. And the nice thing with being able to do data lake and blob store is that I can process the data, get my aggregation, send it out to a data lake. It can be consumed by an on-premise SQL server. That's very easy to do. And I don't have this MPP engine that's charging me, 40, 50 bucks an hour that it's running. So it can save a lot of money. You still have the availability to scale it to where it could be like a 10 rack cluster that's running on demand, or you can pause it, or you can scale it back and scale it down. And it takes minutes versus, a capital expenditure of $10 million up front. So it's kind of a big deal. The calculator is a great way to kind of strategize that too. So understand, just like SQL Server, understand the different types of DR scenarios. What works best for you is always, with the witness server, with the log shipping, when and where to use that. You're going to get questions that are specific. Look at the questions that they're asking, answer the questions they're asking, and if you're like me and skim, you're going to pay for it. You have to read the whole question and make sure that you're answering what they're asking for. And then, of course, the backup and restore with WASB. WASB is just another acronym, Windows Azure Storage Blob Storage. I wish we would be more consistent with calling it a blob store or a storage blob. Those kinds of names become very confusing even to us at times. So, service tiers are important. You're going to see questions about this on the exam for sure. They're not trick questions, but you have to understand what they're asking for. And I would caution that you be cautious. There are some typos that have been submitted where it may say database when it may talk about really mean connections more than it means database. On this exam, I've seen it more than once. So when they're asking something about a service tier and they're requiring 400 databases, they are really talking about, yes, we want to scale up that 400 databases, and the logical answer that you would guess is premium. It's actually not premium in that response. So make sure to read the question. Understand really that the important things when you're implementing this is really about the concurrency on the connections as well as the point-in-time restore, because that's really important. If you're able to go back 7 days versus 35 days at any point in time, that can be a big consideration in whether or not you do premium versus basic. So the next section is design and implement database management systems and security. This is one of the ones where they changed the title. So always check that link that I put up front. Make sure, again, pull the document down. It'll have strike-throughs just like I did for things that were moved. It'll have additions to, in some cases, they removed the acronyms and put a full thing like transparent data encryption versus TDE. A lot of people were like, what's TDE? So they actually break it out. The objectives of this are understand the database configuration for security. We're talking about firewalls, managing logins, users. You will see quite a few questions in this section around logins, firewall rules for sure. Configuring transparent data encryption. The biggest thing with that, you're going to see more the GUI type things. And what I would caution you with this is when it has a question that has multi-parts, you're going to see code examples on this. And it's going to be either T-SQL or it may be PowerShell. And what you're going to do is have a drop down, and you're going to be replacing the pieces of code. So you may be executing, say, a dynamic management view, or you want to execute a store procedure that's a system store procedure, and you're going to be filling in the blanks. If you miss one, the entire thing's wrong. That makes sense, right? There is no half or partial credit for these, so make sure that you review it, but don't overthink it. If you're configuring a firewall rule and it gives you an IP address, which is the publicly exposed one versus the internal one, when you're configuring a firewall rule to connect, it's 0.0.0.0, right? So understand what it's asking again, and don't overthink it when it comes to some of those questions, because they're not tricks. They're just, if you've not done it repeatedly, sometimes it looks logical to do it, but it's not. With the database security, you're going to see stuff with assigning permissions, configuring auditing, configuring encryption. Masking is a big piece with the Azure SQL. You're going to have some out-of-the-box masking features. You're going to see questions about those out-of-the-box masking, as well as when to use custom type masking as well. So if it's an email, you're going to use something out of the box. If it's not, if it's a credit card, social security number, birth date, out of the box. So understand that, and then just know when to implement it with the questions. Data encryption, a lot of that stuff's typically going to be done more through a UI type of question, where it's going to have a simulated web piece, Azure piece, and it's not going to be the prettiest when it comes to it. Again, the testing centers are a little bit behind with some of their graphics and everything else. There's a lot of these that will have select order of operation. So if you want to implement security, add a role, add a user, and then grant them permissions to actually add databases to it, you're going to drag over the order of events that you need to do. Just double check it, don't overthink it. I do it sometimes myself still. So understand securing your database with the firewalls. There are different ways to do it. There's a right way to do it. There's a different way to do it if you need to, say, like do a reverse proxy and you got a jump box. That kind of stuff is not going to be on the exam, right? That's someone that's KISP certified that's going to come in and says, we really need to secure this, and the public exposing the IP addresses, even if they change every 30 days, isn't enough. So this gives them that with the database firewall rules. It's just like SQL Server. It's not whitelisted out of the box. You actually have to expose it. So it's not that hard, but it's not fun to go into your hotel room trying to connect to your SQL Server and realize that you don't know what your IP address is. So you say, what is my IP address? Get it, throw it in there. It's pretty nice with some of that. With the portals, if you have not used Azure, get used to the blades. I'm still not completely happy with them, but they've gotten much better over time. And understand that there's more than one way to navigate to the different blades. So if you're in SQL Data Warehouse, for instance, and you want to be able to, you can click on a box that says open it in Visual Studio. Visual Studio is the development tool we use for all the development in SQL Server Data Warehouse and everything else now, SQL Server Data Tools specifically. But if you click on open in Visual Studio, it'll actually take you to the firewall, and you can click on configure firewall rule settings there. Understand things like that are not as important, but firewall does get buried sometimes in the little items and checkboxes on there. You will see things with this. I've not seen anything with specific TDE where you have to set up like PowerShell. With PowerShell, it's usually through a GUI. But with firewall rules, you will see extended store, or just a store procedure type configure or PowerShell configuration with that. And this is, I just threw this out there so you can see there are different ways to do it. Understand though that there are some pieces in Transact SQL. If the server is, like I said, if you pause an instance, you can't actually get to that instance until it's powered on. You may have to revert to PowerShell or through the standard portal to actually power it on before you can actually access it. But Transact SQL does do a lot of this stuff if the instance is up. That goes without saying. And of course, RESTful APIs, everything in the cloud has some RESTful API behind it. I doubt any of you guys, unless you're really wanting to do it, will want to get into this too much unless you're writing code. but everything is exposed through these. Did I see a question? No? So with the security admin, understand the differences between the Azure and the on-premises and VMs with that, with create login, ultra login, drop login. There's some very similar pieces, but if you're in a multi-tenant environment, which a lot of these cases are unless you select a certain class of dedicated virtual machine, like an IaaS implementation, there are going to be limitations on master. And again, this goes back to the SQL Data Warehouse. You have the ability to actually, you do have your own machines, but the way it works is you don't have control to master, because the master database is really just the control node. The distributions are lower level. They're on different nodes. No data is shared, but you can't have access to master in that situation. We don't want you to. Mostly because if you do anything in master, you break the whole thing. That's all from an APS. And then the server role for creating databases, DB manager, DB creator, a little bit of difference in those. The link covers all that. Again, the walkthroughs are important. If you're going to focus on a certain piece, I would really say focus more on the IaaS piece for the security. I think the stuff with the PaaS type stuff, the Azure SQL, is a little simpler to understand. It's going to be less involved in it. And that just goes without saying when you have a PaaS offering versus an IaaS. IaaS is always going to put the control and the work on you, whereas a PaaS is going to be managed for you in most cases. So you got to think more of yourself as like a DB owner, but not a DBA. In an IaaS, you are the DBA and the DB owner. Make sense? Always encrypted. This is changing. This is a thing that's changing with every product we have. If you do HD Insight or with, say, Data Lake is encrypted out of the box. It's just part of it. Whereas other pieces, when we're talking about setting up always encrypted in SQL Server, this was a feature that came out probably about 6 months ago, and you just set it to enabled with the always encrypted, and it's done. When we're talking about security through encryption, HTTPS type stuff, it's all encrypted to the pipe, through the pipe there. It's not like it's free text that's coming through it. So this is really talking about the always encrypted in the database piece. So if you see something that's related to Data Lake, I doubt you will until maybe the next revision. And that's probably, this last one was in June. You may see it actually in the next month or two, another revision. So for the next 2 years, it's supposed to be quarterly updates to these exams, is what they've got funding for. Also, with the always encrypted deterministic versus randomized, this is done through the column selection, which these are panels that are set up as well. And let's see. I think it's pretty straightforward when we set up whether or not they're deterministic or not. Understand which one's weaker. I haven't seen any questions on this in the last 4 tries that I've done, and I take these regularly just to see if anything's new. And I'll cover some of that stuff that's new in the later section. SQL Server dynamic data masking. This is where I was talking about with the masking functions. You have defaults that are credit card, social security number, email, random, custom text. Just understand, you're going to see a few questions on this. It's going to give you a scenario like you've got an email. Which type should you use with that? It's pretty straightforward. Some of the easier questions, what you're going to see in these cases are kind of a tabular format where it's going to give you different scenarios, and it's going to have a checkbox whether or not you want to use something that's default or something that's custom. And then you're going to have a checkbox. With the checkboxes, you have to be careful though, because if you change it, you have to deselect it. Otherwise, it'll leave both of them checked. If it expects a single answer with these exams, it will typically only allow you to select one. If it allows you to select more than one, it usually means that it expects more than one answer. I've noticed that over the years. Haven't seen anybody change that yet. So here's a practice question from the exam. So you're the administrator setting up an Azure SQL Data Warehouse that will be deployed on a new SQL Server object or new server object. After creating the server and database, you are able to connect it to the management studio from your workstation. You need to establish connection. What should you do? I think this has 2 answers. Anybody? I heard an A. I heard A and B. A and B are the correct answers. So this, if you notice, it says, when it asks what should you do, it doesn't say answer the right question or give the response. Sometimes it'll say answer all the questions that are correct. But read that question and understand that there may be more than one response. And like I said, sometimes it doesn't hurt to click more than once and see if it changes when you click a selection. If it's a random choice question like this, then it's pretty straightforward. HA, disaster recovery, I know this stuff is redundant with this exam. It's designed to be that way. And again, with some of the adaptive nature of it, it's going to be redundant in the sections as well. You can see that they removed 2 of the sections in here. I only leave these in here just so you can see that it has changed from quarter to quarter. And these are some of the more recent updates as well. I think most of this is because the exam base honestly is improving. We're getting more exams out there, and there's a better place to put it than here. So when we're talking about design, high availability solution topology, this is going to get into, actually I have a slide next that shows that with the elastic pooling. It's important to understand what the elastic pools are for, how to best implement them. And really, when you're talking about a large number of databases that can change with the number of users in them throughout the day, really where the cost effectiveness is. And that's where they come into play, I think, the most. Because if you can pull them all together, use some of the same resources, and you have a lighter traffic database throughout the day, and when it gets busy at night and vice versa, then you can really save a lot of money on that. And you still have the HA capabilities within it as well. You also want to be able to design a scale-out solution. This is more, I'll be surprised if that's still in there because SQL Server doesn't do a scale-out as much as SQL Data Warehouse. It's more scale-up versus scale-out. Multi-master scenarios, that's one that I've seen added as well with database replication. And then elastic scale for SQL database, again, that's to me is SQL Server Data Warehouse more than it is SQL database. We're talking SMP versus MPP, so MPP being massively parallel processing, SMP being symmetric multiprocessing. So a shared everything versus a shared nothing, right? Design, implement SQL database, data recovery, backup solution for your data warehouse. Understand that there are multiple backup solutions just as well. And that includes being able to have an on-premise that's backed up and restored to the cloud in those cases. A hybrid scenario there is something to consider as well, versus just having a failover site and a main site, right? So with the basic and premium, I've got a link. This is one of the ones where I have the link that's actually in the notes. And if you guys don't see it in there, you can shoot me an email and make sure you get it. But understand the DTUs, how they're utilized. And when we talk about DTUs, DWUs, QBEs, all that stuff, it's really just scale units in that. And it's really about how much each piece is. When we're talking about data warehouse workload units, it really tries to equate it to, you can't really do apples to oranges saying, well, how many compute nodes is that? Because it's really not the same thing. It's really about I/O and IOPS and everything, number of users and concurrency and stuff like that. Yes? The eDTUs? Those are the elastic DTUs, so the distributed transaction units, or data transaction units with that one. DWUs are data warehouse workload units, and then the analysis services has, I think it's QBEs. It's something Qs, query transaction units, QTUs, I think. Database replication, understand the supported configurations. Also here, 2012 SP3 and higher. I think when you see 2017 come out, you should go ahead and start marking off the bottom ones. We're only going to support certain versions going back, so everybody that's on SQL 2008 R2 really needs to start thinking about getting off that. It's old technology anyway. If you're on 2008, I don't know what to tell you. honestly. It's good. I still have customers that are on SQL 2000, though, believe it or not. It was a solid product. What can you say? Understand that the database, when we're talking about the cloud, that it's got to be a push subscriber of a SQL publisher. Understand that when we're talking about snapshot and one-way transactional replication, that it's not going to operate the same in a PaaS offering, and it's not going to work the same way in the cloud either, unless you actually have, if you have an IaaS setup that's just like a local domain, then you can have a publisher and distribution, all those agents running at the same time. But if you're talking about a difference between a hybrid scenario, there's only going to be a push subscriber in that. One-way transactional replication. Does anybody here use replication for DR? Thank God. It's not a good idea. I've seen people do it all the time, and they may add some new structures into a database, and they never actually add it to the articles, and it never gets distributed, and then they're looking for it on disks that don't exist anymore. So I'm not even a fan of log shipping with that case. I like transactional replication, do a full backup with recovery, and don't grab it and restore it. So here's another practice question. This is a measure up exam type question here. So this is just an Azure database named DB1. You're going to see DB1 and those kinds of things mentioned a lot. And you need to design a solution to identify critical issues on DB1. You must monitor the following: connection failures, deadlocks, throttling. What should you do? And it says choose the correct answer. Can you guys read the questions or responses? I don't have to lift my glasses up. Anybody? Second one, use the sys event log dynamic management view, DMV. Yep. Do you guys use DMVs? No. They're gaining more and more popularity just because they persist some data in some cases where a profiler may not. We've used them more and more with SQL Server Data Warehouse and APS as well, because they just were able to maintain them in our own back system where we couldn't before in log. Yes? No, you'll see this one, this type of one on the question, because this is more of a PaaS type question where it's managed for you, but you're trying to do the analytics to find out what the performance bottlenecks are. It's not worrying about the hardware per se, like IaaS, where you may have to change the memory class of the machine to give it more memory or a larger local disk. But in this case, it's still a database that you're just trying to measure the performance bottlenecks. So. You'll still see, yeah, you'll still see those types. Yes? So SQL Profiler is going to be something that you're going to set up and configure. And it may not, again, if you don't have access to master, SQL Profiler can be somewhat of a bear and not give you all the information that you need, whereas a DMV is going to give you that pass-through capability to see everything that's going on underneath. And again, unless you've had Profiler running, which can be pretty traumatic to your engine at the time, if you've got a lot of transactions going through it, DMV is much better to use because it can take snapshots of the data over time and get aggregates that are running that maintain a continuous flow for that. So I would just say that it's going to give you a little bit more insight, especially in a PaaS type offering. If you have full access to master and the local system, then knock yourself out. But if you've used Profiler for anything in a heavy production environment, you can be the problem if it's not done properly. So, you guys still use like SPWho and SPWho2 and DBCC, input buffer, all that stuff to track down DBA type stuff? It's still good stuff to have. So this is one of the practice questions I was talking about, where you're going to have drop-down boxes, and I'll probably get in trouble for sharing this, but I thought it was important to show you that This is pretty atypical of some type of questions that you might have on the actual exam as well, because it does actually give you 2 option boxes for each one, and then you just select which one. And the thing I don't like about this is that if you miss one, the entire question may count as no points. So you don't get partial points for an incorrect response. And I wish it was a little bit more structured to where you knew it would show you like how many points this question is worth. Maybe it puts a little more pressure on me, but at least I know, right? So in this, it's saying you're configuring for HA, always on availability groups configuration shown in the exhibit. All SQL Server instances run SQL 2016. You will see questions that are related to 2012, 2014, 2016 on this exam. Don't let that concern you unless you know that there's a major change with maybe an extended store procedure or a DMV between versions. Maybe one didn't exist before. I've not seen it. Again, it's not designed to trick you. It's just, I haven't focused so much on that. So how should you configure the servers? To answer, select the configuration settings from the drop-down menus. And this is a little bit more complex, so I'll just show how it's set up here. And this would be the correct response in this. Any questions about that? So now I gotta lift my glasses up. So you've got the primary data center and you've got the secondary remote data center. So SQL C is secondary. So when you talk about asynchronous, this may be like a dual load scenario where you basically want to configure or confirm that A is correct first. And once it is, then you load the second set. So that's how I look at it. Yeah, but it's also in the primary data center. The other one's in the secondary, the failover data center. So you got A and B both in the primary, C's in the secondary. So that would be a full site recovery for DR. And this is, I think, section 4, monitor and manage database implementations. This actually changed from configure to monitor and manage. So this is one of those whole sections that moved into another exam. This is where we're talking about dynamic management functions in here versus dynamic management views, monitor performance and scalability, database and instance activity, troubleshooting databases. Again, a lot of coverage on these that is somewhat redundant, but is related more to an IaaS type of implementation. And then automate and manage database implementations. This is really about consistency, right? So if you're setting up a development environment or a production environment on multi-sites, how best to implement it, using either run books or ARM templates and that kind of stuff. Oop. Wrong button. Service tier advisor. There's several advisors that are in here that you won't see on a local SQL server. Service tier advisor is one of those that's good, and it's got some great walkthroughs within Azure about setting it up and why to set it up. It takes into account all the resource consumption, database sizes, disaster recovery plans, and it'll examine past historical activity in 15-second intervals and then aggregate into larger 15, 30-day analysis. I think what's important here, it's important to understand what the tool does, what it can do, but it's also important to understand what it can't do, right? Because any tool that has some type of machine learning, some type of algorithm behind the scenes is a tool. You're still going to be the brain behind the operation. And that's just in practice. Now, for the exam, you may have to rely on it completely and accept what it says. It doesn't take into account the SLAs that you may have for uptime, or that we may have as well, where it may be a 3x9 or it may be a 3x9x7. I don't think we have anything that's really 4 nines yet, except maybe Data Lake. and I think that's still 3 nines. But understand point time restore, point time our performance objectives, and that kind of stuff. And then we've got the different resource monitoring tools and other DMVs and DM functions. Understand really when and where to each one. Some's based on 5-minute averages, some are based on 15-second averages, and the percentages relative to the performance level. I think the key here is understand you can reconfigure a lot of these graphs. So if I'm happier with bar charts than I am a line chart in some cases because I can see the performance quickly over time. It's just something I'm used to seeing. But sometimes you use some flexibility with how many objects and what types of objects you can have on the screen as well. Because when you configure these, they stay pretty static with that unless you log out and log into someone else. I think, again, you can tell that my screen, I like to have a dark screen. So your screen probably won't look like this. It'll probably be a white background. With the database monitoring troubleshooting, again, I put all the tools out here. These are Performance Insight with V12 version. The SQL Database Advisor, these are the DMVs that it's going to hit, where you're doing the monitoring and troubleshooting. And then event auditing, again, the links. These are nice because this one you can actually download in an Excel spreadsheet. And we have some customers that have to do this and they may analyze it over time as well, separately, or they may consolidate a lot of them into different instances. So all the links will be shared on these with the walkthroughs as well. But when you're talking about query tuning and stuff, it's really around these DMVs that are in here, and then the database advisor and the performance insight. Some of the database monitoring with the extended events. I haven't seen anything with extended events outside of a single practice exam out of maybe 20 different exams practicing on it. It's not something that I've seen that gave me any worry either. So I wouldn't focus on the outliers, I think, of the exam, things that you don't see in a regular day-to-day piece, because most of the stuff is going to be about setting up a standard replication, having replicas going on, backups, restores, HA. But when you're talking about extended events, I think you'll see 1 or 2 questions at most on that. So differences, this is again is the differences between the versions that are out there, PAS, IaaS, on-premise. Using on database instead of on server, again, this has to do with about where you're controlled, where basically your perspective is as the user. I don't see anything there. I think I would just, with the link, just if there's a walkthrough, if you do a high-level walkthrough on some of the bigger sections I put, it's going to cover most of these topics in one walkthrough, which is pretty nice. So I think that's the easiest way to learn. You're going to have an example on this or in the exam, you're going to have questions that are going to cover both the GUI, being the blades, as well as PowerShell. You could get either one on this type of question. And the biggest piece here is the noun and the verb piece with the PowerShell. Look at it. I don't think the PowerShells, unless you're doing PowerShell a lot, I wouldn't focus too much on it. I would do probably the measure up type exams and get familiar with what it's asking for. But I wouldn't, just for the exam, I wouldn't get a book on PowerShell and learn everything about it just for the exam. You're not going to see, I don't think, enough questions on it that it's going to impact your score. In my personal opinion, but with this, nobody cares if you got a perfect score on the exam. Passing is passing, right? So that's the only thing. Nobody even sees the score of your exam except you. So the only thing they check is that, yes, you passed it. That's the only thing Microsoft shares. Here's another practice. I think I got one more practice question on this. So you're the database administrator for an Azure SQL database for your company. The database is used by a web app, and the IT manager creates a new slot for this web app. You need to make a copy of the Azure SQL database based on a snapshot of the current Azure SQL database. And database is in there twice. See, that's a typo on the exam, not on me. For the newly created website, which Azure PowerShell commandlet best accomplishes this task? And you're going to see that there's some specific pieces that they're looking for with this. Which one? D's right.
Don't ask me about SQL, but I know how.
Yeah. So some of the, again, I think these are old hat for a lot of folks. To be honest with you, until Microsoft required our exams, I hadn't done any exams since SQL Server 6.5 until they required it again. I hate exams. I didn't get my master's and everything else, so I could go take exams, right? But these exams, I think, are much better than the old exams because you really do have to have a knowledge of what's going on under the scenes. It's not something I would expect someone to take a boot camp on over a weekend and be able to pass. You actually have to understand the concepts behind this to be able to pass them, or have one great photographic memory of recall to be able to do a cram and have it all in there. Not saying you can't get to measure up exams and study for 30 days and go and take it and not actually do it and pass it. I've seen that happen too, but I think it's just much harder than it used to be. So to me, these are all straightforward. When you're looking at the case studies, looking at the list of pieces, you can start top down or you can break it out into smaller elements. As you saw, I had little distinct pieces for each section. You can start from the bottom, work your way up. I think it's easier to start from the top down and then look for what the gaps are with that. When you don't know the answer to a question, eliminate the wrong answers, right? It's standard test taking. Mark items for review on this, except for that scenario type question. You may have one or two of those. You can mark these questions and come back to them. So if you're pressed for time, 3 hours is plenty of time to take this exam a couple times. Frustrating as it might be, but you do have plenty of time during this exam. I know that the testing centers I take on this exam, the first time I took it, I ran out of the front and the back drawing up the scenario question in the first 5 minutes. And she said, just wave your hand if you have another question or you need something. So I waved my hand in front of the camera, and she wanted to swap out the sheet that I was taking notes on, and I needed more note paper. And we bickered for about 5 minutes saying, no, this is not enough. So I wish you could take in one of those very fine Sharpies to use. But if you're given the option, I would probably ask for a piece of note paper and a pen versus a Sharpie and a wipey. But my guess is you're going to have a Sharpie and a piece of paper to wipe off on. Take very small notes where you can just read them. That's my recommendation there. Guessing at the end of the day is better than nothing. Again, you're not getting points deducted, you're only getting points added, so a correct response, even on a guess, is still going to be a point for your favor, not against you. Not that I'm sure that matters. And when I say that, it's because once you get a passing score, or a suitable score for passing, it's done. I mean, it's just the way it works. And if you studied, don't second guess yourself. I think everybody does this, right? We know the right answer, but that other one just looks like something, maybe that's the right one. So never second guess yourself. Again, this test is not designed to trick you. If you've studied it, you know the answer, go with your gut, right? Go with your instinct on that. A few others. What I do, and it's so hard, I'm sure it's hard for everybody, is I set aside time if I have an exam and I want to study, say I want to learn R or something, I'll block out time on my calendar every day. And somehow it always gets overscheduled, right? But you have to take that initiative to set aside, right? They always talk about work-life balance at work, right? So this is where that work-life balance comes into play. Your study, your career is the most important thing to you, right? Or it should be, because it's not important to somebody else. It's what's important to you. So mark it on your schedule, stick to it at least a couple times a week, and I mark it as private on my calendar so people don't say, oh, he's just studying for an exam, right? And mine's usually at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I just got rid of the runs because they see that I'm trying to lose some weight and stuff, and they just say, hey, he's not going to lose weight, so schedule a meeting during that. I always say know the GUI, know the code. And what I mean by that is you have the ability with PowerShell and everything else to do everything in this, but in Azure, you're going to be using the GUI more than you are, I think, the code, unless you're doing a deployment type scenario. It's getting better, but if you know the GUI and you know the code, you're going to be fine with this because you're going to see both types of questions on this. And with this exam, you're going to see a mixture, probably 50-50, maybe a little bit more heavy on the code this time as it's getting more evolved. But a lot of the newer stuff, you're going to see a GUI. And if it's something, I'll say just as an aside, if you're doing something like Apache with Hadoop HD Insight, because of the way that's configured, you actually have no way to use the new tools to do it. So you have to do the old way of doing it, which actually required an ARM template. So you had to execute a JSON script to get it to work. And that's kind of a pain because then you have to whitelist everything else and stuff like that. I say take the practice test, learn the gaps, and again, the environmental variables where you're going to be taking the exam. Or I think they add a 20% element to the exam because if you're frustrated going in, it's not going to be, it's not fun, right? Thankfully, they lock your phones and everything up in a place where you can't get it. Get plenty of sleep, no drinking the night before. Do not take a test here if you've been partying the night before. And you guys know that you can take this exam right next door for free while you're here, the practice exam, measure up. They've got 473, 475. The only one they don't have that I've seen are the ones that are in beta. If you take a beta exam, it's typically 6 to 12 weeks where you'll get the score after the beta goes live. And if they have a retake offer for an exam, if you fail it, there are certain times a year where you can take an exam. If you fail it, they'll send you a voucher to retake it within 30 days for free. Check with the testing center when you do that. They should know. But if it's in beta, there is no retake on that. And you won't know if you passed it or not for a good while until after the exam's over. And that's because they're actually doing some evaluation of the questions, make sure they're appropriate, make sure there's some consistency with the responses and that kind of stuff. But I would encourage you, if you do get a voucher, I think they're 50% off here during the event. So it's a good opportunity. I told someone earlier today that if you have questions about scheduling the exam, if you want to get 50% off, go talk to those guys over there, see if you can schedule it 30 days out from now and go ahead and get the discount. It's not bad. And if you're not really worried about the exams, but you want the knowledge and stuff, I would encourage you also to look at products like edX, maybe not for 473, but edX.org, which is a MOOC, the massively online open source content. Those are great. And Microsoft, we have 2 tracks, Microsoft professional programs that are data science track, some great SQL stuff in there. And then we also have a big data track, and then I think a new online applications track. I've done 2 of them, and it's very similar to probably going to a community college and taking courses. The data science track is actually pretty fun. You'll have a competition at the end of them too, which is a little bit nerve-wracking because you're competing against peers for machine learning, which is fun, but and you're ranked on that score. edX.org. And so this was really the objectives. Hopefully that this met the objectives of that. Yes?
Yeah, if you do the 50%, you can only do it here.
Is that true?
Yeah, but you can buy 40% off and take it later.
And schedule it for later. Okay, good. So if you guys have any other questions, feel free to ask. I will actually see the evaluations this time, so I'm always trying to improve this. This course is getting dated where I'm going to have to rewrite it, and apologies for any typos that are on it, but I live right outside of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I'm a transplant. I moved from Guam. Yes, sir?
You said you had some course on the skip.
Yes, I actually have a study guide that has all these links in a Word document if you want to get a copy. Yeah, I'm a thumb drive. So thank you for coming in. Any questions, let me know. Thank you.